Today we're going to be making flower vases. I've already drawn one myself. If you don't want to draw your own, you can always trace one, but I'm not going to show you how I did it just because this is more of a painting video. So we're going to get started. First, I'm going to get a really light blue because I want the water to be kind of crystal clear. So for the water in the vase, we're going to do a really, really light blue. And then if we want it to be darker later, we can always add some more colors on top, but it's always best to go lighter first. Before I add the color, I'm just going to take a clean paintbrush and add some water to the painting. And I'm just gonna go over even where I have the stems planned, and I'm just going to give it a good layer of water so that I can add some color on top of it after. Being careful not to let it dry too fast, I'm gonna add my color now. So just a little bit of blue to the tip. And it's just gonna add a really nice light touch to the water. So here there's more water than color, and that's why it looks so light and kind of like the water you would see in a vase. So I'm gonna let that dry, and then I'm going to do the top part of the water. For the top part of the water, I guess I'll call it the wave. I do want it to be just a little darker, so first I'm gonna add some water into this, and remember that this part is completely dry before you start the next step. So I'm adding just a little bit of water, and this time I'm gonna add just a bit more color than water than last time. So that's gonna be a bit of a richer color. So I'm just going to trace around the edges, and I'm using a really thin paintbrush for this step. So I'm going to trace around the edges and then work on filling in the center a bit more. And that's it. So once that dries, I'm going to outline this line right here and the outside of the vase. Alright, so for my stems, I like to use a mixture of two colors. I use olive green, and then I mix that with sap green, which is a little bit lighter. And I feel like the two colors together just make a bit of a paler but light green at the same time. So that's the color that I'm going to use for the stems. And for this entire painting, I'm going to be using a really thin paintbrush just because it's a smaller size. I've divided my page into quarters, so I'm just using 1/4 and it's quite small. So I'm going to be using my thinnest paintbrush for the entire painting. So first I'm gonna start on this shortest stem right here. So making sure that my whole painting is dry because I don't want the colors to run into each other. I'm gonna start, and I'm making sure that I don't have too much paint on my paintbrush, so I'm just gonna dab it on my paper towel to make sure there's no runoff, and then I'm gonna start. Okay, so I did a very, very thin line, but don't be discouraged if it's a little thicker when you begin because some stems are thicker, so that's all right. But just try to make sure that when you taper off at the end, it is quite thin and light, and that'll be good for when you do some flowers. So I'm just gonna finish the other two stems and maybe add some extra leaves to the sides, and then I'm gonna get started on my flowers. So I'll show you really quick close up how I do my leaves on the side, and then I'll speed it up and show you my entire process. So I'm going to start with maybe the stem here. I want a bit more leaves to it, so I'm going to actually start just below the top of the vase, and I'm going to pull up some color. And I just want these to be a little like extensions of the larger stem. So I'm gonna do 2 lines like that. And then for the leaf, I'm going to press a little harder on my paper, pull out, and then right as I want it to taper off, I'm gonna pull my paintbrush up a little bit more to make it thin at the tip. So I'll do another one. So I'm gonna press down harder, round it a bit, and then lift off really lightly, and do the same on the other side. And those are gonna be my leaves. So I'm gonna add some more leaves to each main stem. And there's no rule that I use for this. So I encourage you to kind of figure out what you think looks good, and it's okay if you make a mistake or if you add maybe too many or too little. It's just really trial and error and what you think looks good. So I'll show you the rest of my leaves in a sped up version, and then we'll work on the flowers. All right, so now that we're done the stems and leaves, we're gonna start on the flowers. For this part, I'm gonna use the next size up of my paintbrush, so I'm gonna use a size 4, and it has a rounded tip, which will be good for the flower petals. For my first flower, I'm gonna be using this color. It's called Crimson Lake Deep, so it's a bit more of a deeper red, and I'm gonna be using this to make more of a tulip shaped flower. So I think I'm going to put that one right here. So I'm gonna use the lowest stem. And just notice how I've placed my stems at different heights and lengths on the page so that it looks more interesting. So this is lower, there's different levels to it, which makes it uneven, but those uneven shapes and tableaus on the paper make it look like a more interesting and more aesthetically pleasing painting. So now that we've got that, I'm gonna start. My tulip is now all dry, so I'm gonna use the darker red on top, and this is called Alizarian Crimson, if anyone's interested. So I'm using the same size paintbrush, and I'm just going to trace over the petals, but a little bit unevenly so that it just looks a little bit more complicated and interesting. So I'm still tracing in the same area as my first petals, but I'm adding just a little bit of color, making it look a little bit more deeper. Sometimes I like to make sure that the bottom of the petal is completely darker, because as you'll see in nature, petals are more dark towards the stem and then they get brighter at the top. Now we're going to move on to the second flower, which is going to be on the second lowest stem. I'm using the color Purple Lake, and it's this one right here. So it's a bit of a reddish purple, I would say, so it'll go well with the first flower that we did. And for this one, I'm using my thinnest paintbrush. And sometimes for these flowers, I just kind of like to experiment a little bit. So I'm actually just going to be doing some curves and swirls, but very lightly. And again, this is just going to be the first layer of the flower. So I'm using a really light version of that purple lake, and I'm just doing some swirls around it, and then I'm going to come back to this later and do a darker color on top. So once that dries, which won't take too long, I'm going to use the same color, but I'm going to make it more concentrated. So that means using less water and more of the color from your palette. And I'm going to do the same thing, but on top of my color already. So it's already dry because I didn't really use that much water. So I'm going to start, and I'm using the very tip of my paintbrush to get that really thin brush stroke. And that's it. And sometimes just at the bottom, I just like to add a couple petals that look like they're kind of falling off. It just makes it look more interesting. So now that that's done, we can move on to our third and final flower. I'm going to use a bit of a deeper blue, and I think this one's called Ultramarine. So I'm going to be using this one, and I'm going to do more of a lilac type flower. So I'm going to take some of that, and then I'm going to use some of my purple, and I'm going to mix them together, and this will be the first layer of color for this flower. And I'm using a square paintbrush, or like a flat tip paintbrush, but it's still very thin, and I'm just going to be using the ends of it. So for this stem here, I'm gonna start a little bit lower, because for these flowers, sometimes you see the stem a bit more into the flower. So I'm gonna start just around here and make note of where I want the base of the flower to be. I don't want it to be too large, so I think that's good. And then I'm just gonna trace or dab around the outline of where I want this flower to grow. And that's it, that's my shape. So I want the bottom to be a little bit more rounded than I planned originally, so I'm just gonna add some there. And because we're not using that much water, because it's more of a delicate painting, the paint dries really fast. So it's already dry, so I'm gonna start just to dab a little bit in the middle. And for these kinds of flowers, I like to leave lots of negative space in the middle. So you'll see some white, you'll see some paper coming through, and it looks pretty good. So once that dries, I'm gonna add a darker color to this. I want this flower to be a bit darker, so I'm actually gonna use some Prussian blue, and very lightly, I'm gonna add some blue to the rest of my lilac. So I'm just gonna dab it again, just like I did before, keeping with the shape of the flower that I already planned out in the first coat. And for this flower, it's okay if you have a little bit more water on your paintbrush, because I feel like it just looks better when it dries like that. So that looks good. And I'm gonna do a third layer of color for this flower, and I'm actually just going to use straight purple. So I'm gonna use some of my purple, but really lightly, so I'm gonna add more water to it than anything. And then once the top coat's dry, you can add your final layer of color. And I just want a bit more of that purple to give it some depth and bring through the blue in the first layer that we put on. And I'm really just dabbing the paper, so this one's not complicated at all. Okay, and we are all done. Thanks for watching.